Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, so my name is Pengyuan Liu, and I'm a PhD student in the School of Geography, Geology, and Environment at the University of Leicester. Today, I'm going to give a talk about my paper, Modeling Urban Social Demographic Change Using Knowledge Graph. In the 1960s, Jane Jacobs described that cities happens to be problems in organized complexity. Like life science, they present situations in which half a dozen or several dozen quantities are all verifying or all varying simultaneously and in subtly interconnected way. Such consistent emergence and development of cities and urban regions bring significant changes on the social demographic changes of the cities, um, which have been widely studied in the field of GIScience. For the scope of this paper, I will start introduce two of the most commonly seen approach to describe the socio-economic status of places at both national and urban scale. One of them is geodemographics based on the sensor data. Another one is the English indices of multiple deprivation, which shortened as IMD in this paper. Both of the approaches provide characterizations of areas through the typical characteristics of people that live there. Such methods have greatly benefited researchers to understand urban development, as well as supporting urban planning decisions. However, as already mentioned by several researchers, that such social demographic classifications heavily relying on publicly collected data, which have severe limitations regarding to the temporal limitations. For example, such official statistics are typically collected periodically. For example, the geodemographics based on sensor data, but the sensor data are collected every 10 years. But in reality, local areas are more dynamic and may undergo change that digital sensors do not capture. This brings the research question of this paper is how to solve such a temporal limitations of the social demographic classifications. The answer we provided in this paper is to use the digital content from the data collected from digital platforms. As our life more and more immersed with abundant and rapidly produced data produced through various digital services and platforms, such platforms are changing what constitutes the field. The rise of digital content compromises new forms of evidence with which to approach long-standing geographic concerns. Existing research have identified that the spatial distribution of volunteer geographic information is related to population density, ethnicity, education level, and income. Although every city and platform has its own characteristics, those uneven distribution of the volunteer geographic information is both an issue and an opportunity, which might indicate how the online place representation emerging from those platforms could be used as a proxy to understand the social demographic dynamics. Before moving on to the methodology part, I will provide a general introduction to the data used in this paper. We adopt 5 different data sets in Kingston and Chelsea in Greater London. I will start from the first 3 data sets used in this paper. The first one on the left part is the London output area classification. As you can see, in Kingston and Chelsea, most areas are classified as urban elite as well as London urban life in this area. And also we adopt the IMD cells in both 2015 and 2019. Let's take a more closer look in the change between these IMD cells in these 2 years. As you can see from the right figure here, the areas which are marked as red means that the areas actually developing better between these 2 years, while the blue shows the areas actually developing worse, while gray means there's no change at all. In addition, these provide a general picture of how the data set described by the multiple deprivation D cells. In addition, we use the spatial distribution of two volunteer geographic information. One is the Twitter data, the spatial distribution of Twitter data. Another one is the spatial distribution of the georeferenced Wikipedia data. We calculate the density of two VGI data distribution within each output areas in Kingston and Chelsea, and use Jenks nature break classification method to generate a 5-level classification for both VGI platform, and the densities are classified into, for example, high distribution, median high distribution, median low, and low distribution. Our target is to combine the data set, including the London output area classification, with the VGI, two VGI data distribution, as well as the 2015 depreciation decels, to make a prediction on the depreciation decel change in 2019. There's a bunch of methodology options here, including the traditional machine learning approach, such as supporting vector machine, decision tree, random forest. But in this paper, we present using a completely novel approach, which is using a knowledge graph. A knowledge graph is defined as a graph structure knowledge base where information is represented in the form of relations between the entities, or also known as nodes. For example, as you can see from the knowledge on the right figure here, the people James and Mona Lisa are encoded as nodes in this graph. The sentiment of James like Mona Lisa is encoded as the relation in this knowledge graph. So basically, following the similar structure of how you constructing a knowledge graph, we proposed our own spatial knowledge graph, where we encode areas and each dataset used in this case study encoded as the node in the graph, while the status of a place in each dataset is classified as is encoded as the relation. For example, area 1 has a very high distribution density in Wikipedia distribution categories here. Same applies for area 2. And also area 1 is classified as urban elite in London output area classification, while for area 2 it's classified as London life circle. So our target is to predict the depreciation decels in 2019 for area 2, knowing all other information encoded in this knowledge graph. We formalize such a task as a link prediction task. So I will provide a general introduction on what is a link prediction is. Link prediction is defined to predict the future or missing relations from nodes in a complex graph based on the observed graph structure and node attribute. The output of a link prediction algorithm is the likelihood of the relations between the nodes in the data. For example, in the graph on the right, we have the information regarding to the nodes A, B, C, D, and also we have the relation information between A and B, A and C and D. So the target is to infer like how likely there is a relation or link existent between the node B and C. So the method used in this paper is called complex. I'm not going to dive in too much technical details for this algorithm though, but it's generate a graph embeddings to infer the relations in the knowledge graph. So what is the knowledge graph embeddings? They are low dimensional representations of the nodes and the relations in a knowledge graph. They provide a generalizable context about the overall knowledge graph that can be used to infer the missing or future relations in the knowledge graph. As introduced above, the link prediction output the likelihood or possibility if one relation is existed. So in this paper, we consider if one relation is correctly predicted, if probability score of this relation generated by the algorithm is over 70% possibility. Based on that, we proposed another ranking scheme named confidence ratio. is defined as the percentage of the correctly predicted relations over all the edges in the test data. Table 1 summarizes the results of the experiment. The number of n here means when we construct a knowledge graph, there's n randomly selected areas in the knowledge graph also known their relations, their D cells in 2019. So as you can see from the table 1 here, the algorithm has already provided over 50% confidence ratio when only 10 areas in the whole Kingston and Chelsea has the knowledge about their D cells in 2019. Obviously, the more information knowledge graph has, the higher confidence ratio it can produce. When we have for nearly half of areas in Kingston and Chelsea, the algorithm can produce over 90% confidence ratio here. So for the D cells which are not predicted correctly, we conduct a further experiment to explore the most likely D cells suggested by the model on the number of n is 300. So we have on the experiment when we have nearly half of the areas in Kingston and Chelsea. The figure on the right suggests that there is a small differences are concentrated, which are in the southwest part of the brow, which is pretty much here. There is a small difference around here, and also this area. So figure in this slide shows that for the D cells that are not predicted correctly, the differences between the D cells suggested by the model and 2019 IMD D cells are mostly within two D cells differences. It indicates that despite the fact that some of the D cells are mispredicted, the differences between the D cells suggested by the model and the real D cells are relatively small. So the preliminary analysis of this result seems to indicate that the link prediction algorithm on the knowledge graph has the ability to capture the social demographic change based on a spatially constructed graph with small samples of data. So in the future, we will test on knowledge graphs using different ways of encoding such as the entities and relations of different data sets. We will explore which factors have the highest impact on modeling such dynamics of the social demographic change. We will also test the framework on larger data sets to test the scalability as well as the robustness of the framework. These are the references that I used for this presentation, and thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your feedback or questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pengyuan. So, as I mentioned before, if you have a question for Pengyuan, we've got plenty of time. Please type it in the chat window, which you'll see if you click the little purple icon at the bottom right of the screen, a little speech bubble there, and you can type a question in there. So we have a question immediately from Stephen Clark. Thank you, Stephen. So what was it about Kensington and Chelsea that made you select it as a suitable case study?
Well, we choose Kingston and Chelsea because it's relatively well-developed regions in London, and also the size for this pilot study of Kingston and Chelsea is reasonable. But yeah, this is just one of the case studies which in the future I will definitely test on, for example, the whole London, or even on the national scale for the whole England as well.
And I guess maybe following on from that question, is there anything about Kensington and Chelsea that you think would be more or less predictable than other areas? Because we all know about the problem of spatial heterogeneity, and Kensington and Chelsea is known to be a relatively affluent borough. I don't know if that has a relation with things like generating Wikipedia entries. This is actually a good question, because well, if you look at the
the distribution between two VGI platforms for Kingston and Chelsea, I think they exist some very strong correlations between these two data sets distributed in this area. For example, where the Wikipedia has the highest distribution density, also correlates to the Twitter dataset, which has a relatively median high distribution density here. I think this is also fitting to the how to say that word? The conclusions provided by another paper, which I mentioned above, that such distributions of VGI is also related to more social demographic kind of descriptors, which I think is quite interesting for this pilot study. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just looking down the questions, can I just ask if could we reserve the applause for after the questions, because it makes it a little bit more difficult to go down and find questions.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So I had another question. So it's a long time census. Obviously, the census is the most complete data source we have on demographics. A lot has changed technologically since then in terms of the internet and the way in which we collect data. So the next census is due next year. So what do you think of the prospects for the type of large-scale population survey? Will they continue to be done at a household level once every 10 years, or do you think there's room to do something different?
Sorry. Oh, you're asking about like how my. So can I understand that you're asking about how my framework can be used to sort of like solve the dynamic. Sorry, can you repeat the question again? I'm really sorry.
Perhaps my sound is breaking up slightly. I'm asking more generally about the future of kind of population level censuses, which happen every 10 years. With the change in technology over the past 10 years, do you see a future for that kind of survey, or do you think that you can add in new technologies that will collect this data at a more disaggregate scale, at a higher temporal resolution?
Yeah,
to support your work.
Yeah, I think by adding more technology part into for example, sensor data collection, will definitely benefit a more give a better picture about how the social demographic of the urban area changed and also I hope that my study proposed here can benefit that, because it's proof that we can use the online content, which is we know that is produced very fast and constantly. So I hope with the help of the online content, we can have a more rapid or more short, how to say that, like definitely like solve this kind of temporal limitations of the traditional data collection of this survey-based data.
Okay, we have another question. First of all, Helen Mackenzie says that Kensington and Chelsea actually has some of the worst inequality in London, so says that it's a good choice for a borough to study. Stephen Clark, another question. So how computationally intensive is your method? Will you be able to scale this up to large areas? Yeah. And how will you deal with things like edge effects?
So the algorithm, actually, the computation is produced relatively fast. So for Kingston and Chelsea area, which we have 636 output areas in total in this browser. So it takes like basically 10 minutes to make the prediction. While I also test on the London data already, it can make a prediction in pretty much 15 minutes. So I think the computation complexity of the framework is definitely reasonable and can be very scalable as well when it applies for larger data set.
Okay. And the second part of the question was about edge effects that might be introduced.
Sorry, the
boundaries that you choose. edge
the bound.
effects. Yeah, boundary effects.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Well. So the graph, it's actually a good question because I didn't really think about that before. But the graph is constructed. For example, we also have when I show this graph of the spatial knowledge graph, we also define the neighborhood between areas. For this pilot study, we use the Queen's matrix to define such a neighborhood. But yeah, well, there are definitely more options to explore in the future.